You're lucky there's now a real man in the family. Useless old man. My son-in-law shouted in front of everyone at dinner. Everybody laughed. I simply replied, "Great. Then you pay the bill." When the waiter slid the invoice across the table, $10,000, he completely lost it. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Charles, and at 64 years old, I thought I understood how families worked. I thought respect was something you earned and kept. I was wrong about a lot of things, but I was especially wrong about my son-in-law, Alan. The evening started like any other family gathering I had organized over the past 3 years since Margaret passed away. Claire's birthday was always special to me. She was my only child, my princess, the light of my life even when she made choices I didn't understand. Marrying Alan was one of those choices, but I had learned to keep my opinions to myself. At least I used to. I had made reservations at Chateau Laurent, the kind of place Margaret and I used to go for anniversaries. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, waiters who moved like dancers between tables. The kind of restaurant where a simple dinner could easily cost $300 per person. But money had never been an issue for our family. I had worked hard my entire life, built a successful accounting firm from nothing, and saved enough to ensure my daughter and grandchildren would never want for anything. Claire arrived first, looking radiant in a navy blue dress I had bought her for Christmas. She kissed my cheek with the same perfunctory affection she had shown me since Alan entered the picture. But tonight I chose to focus on the fact that she had at least remembered to say thank you for organizing the dinner. "Dad, you really didn't have to do all this," she said, though her eyes were already scanning the menu with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to expensive restaurants. "Nonsense," I replied, adjusting my tie. "It's not every day my daughter turns 38. Besides, I wanted to do something special for the whole family." The grandchildren, Emma, 12, and Jacob, 10, slid into their seats with the restless energy of kids who would rather be anywhere else. Emma immediately pulled out her phone while Jacob started folding his napkin into increasingly complex shapes. They had been polite enough when they hugged me, but I could see they were merely going through the motions. Alan arrived 15 minutes late, as usual, making his entrance with the kind of swagger that always set my teeth on edge. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, his hair perfectly styled, his smile practiced and hollow. He worked in sales for some tech company, though I had never quite understood what he actually sold or why it required so many business trips. "Charles," he said, gripping my hand with unnecessary force. "Looking good, old man. Still hitting the gym?" I forced a smile. I try to stay active. The dinner progressed as these family gatherings always did. Alan dominated the conversation, telling elaborate stories about his latest business victories, his golf handicap, his plans to renovate their kitchen again. Claire hung on his every word like a teenager with a crush, while the children picked at their food and stared at their phones when they thought no one was looking. I found myself studying Alan's face as he spoke, noting the way his eyes never quite met mine, the way he gestured broadly as if he were performing for an audience. There was something theatrical about everything he did, something that felt calculated and false. "You know, Charles," Alan said, cutting into his $50 steak with deliberate precision, "I've been thinking about your situation." "My situation?" I asked, setting down my fork. "Well, you're getting up there in age, living alone in that big house. It can't be easy, especially after losing Margaret." His voice carried the kind of false sympathy that made my skin crawl. "Claire and I have been talking, and we think it might be time to consider your options." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What kind of options?" "Assisted living facilities, maybe a nice retirement community, somewhere you could be around people your own age, have activities planned for you. Take the burden off your shoulders, you know." The word burden hit me like a slap. I glanced at Claire, hoping to see some sign that she disagreed with her husband, but she was studying her wine glass with unusual intensity. "I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself," I said quietly. Alan laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "Come on, Charles. When's the last time you balanced your own checkbook? When's the last time you made a decision without calling Claire first?" Heat rose in my chest, but I kept my voice level. "I've been managing my own affairs since before you were born, Alan." "Have you, though?" He leaned back in his chair, his smile widening. "Because from where I'm sitting it looks like you're barely hanging on. The lawn service, the housekeeping, the meal delivery. You're practically living in assisted care already." I wanted to point out that I paid for those services because I could afford them, not because I needed them. I wanted to remind him that I had built a business from nothing while he jumped from job to job chasing commissions, but something in his expression warned me that this was leading somewhere darker. "The truth is," Alan continued, his voice carrying across the restaurant, "you're lucky Claire found herself a real man to take care of the family. Someone who can actually handle responsibility." The words hung in the air like smoke. I felt every muscle in my body tense, felt the familiar burn of humiliation creeping up my neck. Around us, other diners continued their conversations, oblivious to the fact that my son-in-law had just called me useless in front of my own grandchildren. "Alan," Claire said softly, but there was no real reproach in her voice. "What?" "I'm just being honest. Charles has had his time, but now there's a real man running things." He gestured broadly at himself, someone who knows how to make decisions, how to provide for a family, how to be a leader. Emma and Jacob exchanged glances, sensing the tension but not understanding its source. I looked at my daughter, silently pleading for her to defend me, to remind her husband that he was speaking to her father, but Claire just sat there, her lips pressed together in what might have been embarrassment or agreement. "You know what, Alan?" I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You're absolutely right." He blinked, clearly not expecting agreement. "You're the man of the family now," I continued, reaching for my wallet. "So I think it's time you started acting like it." I placed my credit card back in my wallet and closed it with a decisive snap. "Why don't you take care of tonight's bill?" Alan's confident smile faltered. "What?" "The bill," I repeated calmly. "Since you're the real man here, the one with all the responsibility, you can handle dinner." "Dad," Claire started, but I held up a hand. "No, sweetheart, Alan is right. It's time for the old man to step aside and let the real leader take charge." The waiter appeared at our table as if summoned by the tension, a leather folder in his hands. "Here's your check, sir," he said, placing it directly in front of me out of habit. I picked up the folder and, without looking at it, slid it across the table to Alan. "Here you go, son. Time to step up." Alan's face had gone pale. With shaking hands, he opened the folder, and I watched as his eyes widened. The total came to just over $10,000, an astronomical sum that reflected the restaurant's finest offerings. The wine I had ordered to celebrate Claire's birthday, the desserts for the children, and the tip I always included for exceptional service. 10,000, Alan whispered, his voice barely audible. "That's right," I said, my voice carrying a warmth I didn't feel. "But don't worry. I'm sure a real man like you can handle it." The silence that followed was deafening. Sitting in my car after that disastrous dinner, watching Alan fumble through his explanation to the waiter about needing to call his bank, I couldn't stop my mind from drifting back to when it all started. When did I become the useless old man in my own family's eyes? It wasn't always like this. There was a time when Claire called me every Sunday, when my grandchildren actually wanted to spend weekends at Grandpa's house, when family decisions included my input. But somewhere along the way, Alan had methodically erased me from my own family, and I had let it happen. The change began subtly, just 3 months after Margaret's funeral. I remember the exact moment because it was the first time someone other than my wife had challenged my authority in my own home. Alan had brought Claire and the children over for Sunday dinner, a tradition Margaret and I had maintained for years. I was struggling in the kitchen, trying to recreate Margaret's pot roast recipe, when Alan walked in uninvited. "Charles, you're doing it all wrong," he said, taking the wooden spoon from my hands without asking. "Margaret never cooked it like that. Claire told me the real recipe." I stood there, holding my empty hands, watching this man take over my kitchen, my tradition, my wife's memory. Claire appeared in the doorway, and I waited for her to tell her husband to back off, to remind him whose house this was. Instead, she smiled gratefully. "Thank God," she said. "I was worried we'd all get food poisoning." Oh, that should have been the moment I put my foot down. Instead, I stepped aside and let Alan finish cooking dinner in my own kitchen. I told myself I was being gracious, accommodating. I told myself it didn't matter who cooked as long as the family was together. I was already making excuses for my own irrelevance. After Margaret died, I had thrown myself into being the best grandfather I could be. I picked up Emma and Jacob from school when Claire was busy, attended every soccer game and piano recital, helped with homework when their parents were too distracted. I thought I was being helpful, filling the void that Margaret's death had created. What I didn't realize was that Alan was using my devotion against me. Charles is always offering to babysit. I overheard him telling Claire one evening when they thought I was napping in my chair. It's like he doesn't have a life of his own. Kind of sad, really. The word babysit stung. These were my grandchildren, my blood. I wasn't babysitting them. I was spending time with family. But Alan made it sound pathetic, desperate, like I was some lonely old man clinging to relevance. The erosion of my position happened in stages, each one seemingly minor but cumulatively devastating. First, Alan convinced Claire that I was too old to drive the grandchildren places, citing insurance concerns and reaction times. Then he suggested that my involvement in their school activities was confusing for the children, that they needed consistency from their parents rather than mixed messages from different generations. "It's not that we don't appreciate everything you do, Dad," Claire had said, her voice gentle but firm. "It's just that Alan thinks we should establish clearer boundaries about parenting decisions." Boundaries. That word became Alan's weapon of choice. There were boundaries about discipline. I was too lenient with the children. Boundaries about finances. My old-fashioned approach to money management was supposedly outdated. Boundaries about family traditions. Apparently, my ideas about holidays and celebrations were stuck in the past. The most painful boundary was the one around my own house. After Margaret died, I had rattled around in our 4-bedroom home like a marble in a shoebox. Claire suggested that maybe I should downsize, and I agreed to consider it. But Alan took that conversation and ran with it, bringing real estate agents to my house without permission, scheduling viewings during my nap times, and discussing my situation with neighbors I had known for 30 years. "We're just trying to help," Alan would say whenever I protested. "Claire is worried about you living alone. We all are." But it wasn't help. It was a hostile takeover. Every suggestion came with an implied criticism of my competence. Every offer of assistance carried the suggestion that I couldn't handle my own affairs. Alan had a gift for making his interference sound like concern, his disrespect feel like kindness. The breaking point should have come last Christmas when Alan decided that my traditional Christmas Eve dinner was too much work for someone your age and moved the celebration to their house without consulting me. I arrived to find my family opening presents around a tree I hadn't helped choose, eating dinner I hadn't helped prepare, following traditions that Alan had unilaterally decided were better than mine. "Isn't this nice, Dad?" Claire had said, seeming genuinely pleased with the new arrangement. "Now you can just relax and enjoy yourself instead of worrying about hosting." But I didn't want to relax. I wanted to be needed, to be useful, to be the patriarch of my own family. Instead, I was a guest in what had once been my domain, watching Alan play the role I had occupied for decades. The children barely noticed the change. To them, Uncle Alan had always been the fun one, the one with the latest gadgets and the money for expensive outings. I was just Grandpa Charles, the quiet old man who sat in the corner and nodded along with whatever the adults decided. I started keeping a mental list of Alan's slights, though I told myself I was being petty. The way he interrupted me when I tried to tell stories about the old days. The way he rolled his eyes when I offered opinions about current events. The way he spoke about me in the third person, even when I was sitting right there. "Charles doesn't really understand how these things work," he would say when discussing modern technology or social media. "His generation just approaches things differently. His generation." As if I were some relic from a bygone era instead of a man who had successfully run a business for 40 years. Who had adapted to countless changes in technology and society, who had wisdom earned through experience rather than arrogance assumed through youth. The worst part was watching Claire transform from the daddy's girl, who used to call me for advice about everything, to a woman who deferred to her husband's judgment about her own father. Alan had convinced her that my feelings were fragile, that my opinions were outdated, that my presence was more burden than blessing. "We have to be patient with him," I heard Claire tell Alan one day. "He's still adjusting to life without Mom." 3 years. It had been 3 years since Margaret passed, and they were still treating me like I was in the acute phase of grief, like I was too delicate to handle reality. They had turned my bereavement into evidence of my incompetence, my loneliness into proof of my irrelevance. Sitting in my car outside the restaurant, watching Alan argue with the waiter about payment plans for a $10,000 dinner bill, I realized that tonight had been different. For the first time in 3 years, I had refused to be diminished. I had called his bluff, forced him to confront the gap between his rhetoric and his reality, and for the first time in years, I felt like myself again. The week following the restaurant incident, I expected angry phone calls, heated confrontations, or at least some acknowledgement of what had happened. Instead, I got silence, complete deafening silence from my daughter and her family. It was as if they had collectively decided that pretending the evening never occurred would somehow erase the humiliation Alan had suffered. But silence, I was learning, could be illuminating. With no family obligations demanding my attention, no requests for financial assistance or logistical support, I found myself with something I hadn't had in years: time to think, to observe, to piece together patterns I had been too busy enabling to notice. It started with a simple phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. Emma had left her cell phone at my house the previous month during one of her rare visits, and I had been meaning to return it. When it rang while I was putting it in my car, I instinctively answered, thinking it might be Claire looking for her daughter. "Emma's phone," I said. There was a pause, then a voice I didn't recognize. "Oh, sorry." I was trying to reach Alan Morrison. "This is Dave from Pinnacle Financial. He gave me this number as an emergency contact." My blood went cold. "I think you have the wrong number." "Maybe. I'm looking for Alan Morrison, account number ending in 7492. He's behind on his consolidation loan payments, and we need to discuss payment arrangements before we proceed with collections." I hung up immediately, my hands shaking. Alan Morrison, not Alan Mitchell, which was Claire's married name, and what I had always assumed was his surname, Morrison. Who was Alan Morrison, and why was he using my granddaughter's phone as a contact number for debt collectors? That night, I did something I hadn't done since my accounting days. I conducted an investigation. It amazed me how much information was available if you knew where to look and had the patience to dig. Public records, social media profiles, business registrations. It was all there, waiting to be discovered by someone with enough motivation and free time. Alan Morrison, it turned out, had quite a history. 3 previous marriages, 2 bankruptcy filings, and a trail of civil lawsuits from creditors stretching back 15 years. The man my daughter had married, the father of my grandchildren, was a professional debtor who moved from relationship to relationship, leaving financial wreckage in his wake. But it got worse. Much worse. I found his social media profiles, the ones Claire probably didn't know about, where he posted under his real name. The pictures told a story that made my stomach turn. Alan at expensive restaurants with other women. Alan on vacation in places I knew Claire had never been. Alan wearing watches and driving cars that cost more than most people's annual salaries. One post in particular made me feel physically sick. It was a photo of Alan holding a glass of champagne, standing in what looked like a penthouse apartment. The caption read, "Living my best life while the old fool bankrolls everything. Sometimes the long game pays off better than you imagine." The comments below were equally revealing. Friends congratulating him on his brilliant strategy and asking for tips on landing a sugar family. One comment made my hands clench into fists. "Dude, you've got it made. Free house, free money, and a wife who thinks you're a god. When are you going to teach a masterclass?" Alan's response was casual, almost bored. "Easy money, man. Find a lonely widow with a guilt-ridden daughter and play the part. Charles is so desperate to keep his family together, he'll pay anything to avoid conflict. Claire's too insecure to question anything I do. It's like taking candy from babies." I stared at that screen for a long time, reading and rereading those words until they burned themselves into my memory. Taking candy from babies. That's what my family had become to him, a source of easy money and minimal effort. The investigation took on a life of its own after that. I discovered that Alan had been systematically lying about his employment status for over a year. The tech company he claimed to work for had no record of him ever being employed there. His business trips were actually visits to his gambling addiction support groups. Court-mandated attendance from a previous arrest for check fraud. But the most devastating discovery came when I traced his financial records. Alan had been using my family's name and credit to secure loans, open credit accounts, and even rent properties. Somehow he had managed to make himself an authorized user on accounts I didn't even know existed. Accounts that Claire had opened with my house as collateral. My home, the house Margaret and I had spent 30 years paying off, the house where we had raised Claire, the house that held every meaningful memory of our life together, was being used as security for Alan's gambling debts. I sat in my study, surrounded by printouts and bank statements, feeling like I was looking at the financial autopsy of my own family. Alan hadn't just married Claire. He had systematically infiltrated our lives, identified our vulnerabilities, and exploited them with surgical precision. The phone calls to debt collectors weren't emergencies. They were routine. Alan had given out family members' phone numbers to creditors, including Emma's cell phone, because he had maxed out his own communication channels. My 12-year-old granddaughter was receiving calls from collection agencies asking for her stepfather. Then I found the recordings. Alan had been secretly recording family conversations for years, storing them on a cloud account he thought no one could access. I listened to myself offering to pay for the children's school expenses, heard Claire discussing my financial situation with Alan, witnessed entire conversations where they debated how much money they could ask me for without raising suspicions. "He's getting old, and he feels guilty about Margaret," Claire's voice said through my computer speakers. "If we frame it as helping the kids or maintaining family traditions, he'll pay for anything." Alan's laugh was cold and calculating. "The man's worth over $2 million and he's desperate to feel needed. We could probably get him to fund our entire lifestyle if we play this right." "I feel bad sometimes," Claire admitted. "He's my father." "He's a resource," Alan corrected, "and resources exist to be utilized. Besides, it's not like he's going to live forever. Think of this as an early inheritance with the bonus of not having to wait for him to die." I stopped the recording there. I couldn't bear to hear any more. The worst part wasn't even the money, though the amount they had taken was staggering. Over the past 3 years, I had given or loaned them nearly $400,000 for various emergencies and opportunities. House repairs that were never made, investment opportunities that never materialized, children's expenses that were greatly exaggerated. The worst part was realizing that my own daughter saw me as nothing more than a bank account with sentimental attachments. Every family dinner, every birthday celebration, every holiday gathering had been carefully orchestrated to maximize their access to my resources while minimizing my actual involvement in their lives. I had been so focused on trying to be useful, so desperate to maintain my connection to family after Margaret's death, that I had made myself into exactly what they saw me as, a resource to be managed and exploited. But knowledge I was beginning to understand was power, and for the first time in 3 years I held all the cards. The next morning I called my lawyer, not to confront Alan or demand immediate justice, but to begin the slow, methodical process of protecting what remained of my assets and my dignity. If Alan wanted to play games with my family's financial security, he was about to discover that he had been playing against someone who had forgotten more about money management than he would ever know. The old fool, as he had called me, was about to become a much more formidable opponent than he had bargained for. The beauty of having spent 40 years in accounting is that you learn to think in systems, to understand how money flows and where it gets trapped. You learn patience, precision, and the art of making significant changes that look like minor adjustments. Alan had counted on my ignorance and my emotional attachment to my family. He hadn't counted on my professional expertise. I started small, methodically, like a surgeon making careful incisions. The first change was something Alan would never notice immediately. I removed myself as the automatic payment source for Emma and Jacob's private school tuition. Instead of the money transferring seamlessly from my account each month, the school would now send bills directly to Claire and Alan's address. It was a subtle shift, but one that would create a $12,000 monthly reality check. The children attended Brookfield Academy, one of the most prestigious private schools in the state, where annual tuition ran close to $50,000 per child. I had been covering these costs for 3 years, ever since Alan convinced Claire that their children deserved the best education money could buy. "Think of it as an investment in their future," Alan had said, his arm around Claire's shoulders as they presented their case. "These kids will be competing with children who have every advantage. We can't let them fall behind because of financial limitations." Of course, the financial limitations he was referring to were his own, not mine. But I had agreed, believing that providing for my grandchildren's education was one of my most important responsibilities. Now I understood that Alan had simply found a way to avoid paying for his own children's schooling, while positioning himself as the caring stepfather who wanted the best for them. The second change involved the credit cards. Over the years, I had added Claire as an authorized user on several of my accounts, thinking it would give her financial security and emergency access to funds. What I hadn't realized was that she had given Alan complete access to these cards, essentially making him an unauthorized user with unlimited spending power. I spent an afternoon on the phone with customer service representatives, carefully removing Claire's access while explaining that I was simplifying my financial portfolio. I made sure to emphasize that this wasn't due to any problems or disputes, just a desire to streamline my accounts as I got older. The representatives were sympathetic and efficient, and within hours Claire's cards would simply stop working. The third change was more complex, but potentially more devastating. I began the process of removing my house as collateral from loans I had never agreed to co-sign. This required my lawyer's involvement, as Alan had somehow managed to forge documents that made me responsible for debts I knew nothing about. The legal process would take time, but eventually, Alan would find himself responsible for his own financial obligations without my assets backing his promises. But the most important change was one that Alan would never see coming, because it existed entirely on paper. I restructured my will and my financial beneficiaries, removing Claire as the primary inheritor of my estate and creating a complex trust that would provide for Emma and Jacob's genuine needs while preventing Alan from accessing any significant funds. My lawyer, Robert Chen, had known me for 15 years and had handled both my business and personal legal affairs. When I explained the situation, his expression grew increasingly grim. "Charles, what you're describing sounds like financial elder abuse," he said, reviewing the documents I had gathered. "We could pursue criminal charges against Alan and potentially recover some of the money he's taken." I shook my head. "I don't want revenge, Robert. I want protection. I want to ensure that my grandchildren are genuinely cared for, and I want to make sure that no one can ever use my assets to fund their own irresponsibility again." "The trust structure you're proposing is quite sophisticated," Robert noted, scanning my proposed changes. "It would provide for the children's education, health care, and basic needs, but it would prevent anyone from accessing lump sums or using the funds for non-essential expenses." "Exactly. Alan married into this family for financial gain. I want to remove that gain while protecting the people who actually matter." The most delicate part of the process was timing. I needed to implement these changes gradually, in a way that wouldn't immediately alert Alan to what was happening. He was clever and manipulative, but he wasn't financially sophisticated. He had relied on charm and emotional manipulation rather than understanding the actual mechanics of money management. I also had to be careful not to harm Emma and Jacob, who were innocent victims in their stepfather's schemes. The last thing I wanted was for the children to suffer because of their parents' poor choices. The trust I was establishing would actually provide them with more long-term security than Alan's chaotic financial management ever could. Within 2 weeks, I had quietly dismantled most of the financial infrastructure that had been supporting Alan's lifestyle. The private school would soon be sending bills that he couldn't pay. The credit cards would stop working at the most inconvenient moments. The loan officers who had been treating him as a valued customer because of my backing would suddenly become much less accommodating. But I wasn't content to simply cut off the money flow. I wanted Alan to understand that his actions had consequences, that the old fool he had been manipulating was neither old nor foolish when it came to protecting his family's genuine interests. I hired a private investigator, a retired police detective named Maria Santos, who specialized in financial crimes. Her job wasn't to build a criminal case against Alan, but to document his activities thoroughly enough that I could present a complete picture to Claire when the time came. "Your son-in-law is more than just a financial predator," Maria reported after 2 weeks of surveillance. "He's got active gambling addictions, multiple ongoing affairs, and he's been systematically identity theft from your family members. This man is dangerous, Charles, not just financially but potentially physically." That information changed my timeline considerably. If Alan was truly dangerous, I couldn't afford to let this situation drag on indefinitely. I needed to accelerate my plans while ensuring my safety and my family's protection. I also made a decision that surprised even me. I started recording my own conversations with family members. If Alan had been documenting our interactions to use against us, I wanted to have my own evidence of what was really happening in our family dynamics. The recordings revealed patterns I had missed before. Alan's subtle manipulation techniques, the way he planted seeds of doubt about my competence, the way he positioned himself as Claire's protector, against my supposed emotional demands. He was a master at making his victims feel like they were choosing to exclude me rather than being manipulated into doing so. But perhaps most importantly, I began to understand how completely Alan had isolated me from my own family. Claire genuinely believed that I was becoming difficult and demanding in my old age because Alan had carefully reframed every interaction to support that narrative. She wasn't conspiring against me. She was being manipulated just as effectively as I had been. That realization changed everything. This wasn't just about money or respect or family dynamics. This was about rescuing my daughter from an abusive relationship before Alan's financial desperation led to even more dangerous behavior. The plan I developed over the following weeks was more complex than simply cutting off funding. I needed to create a situation where Alan's true nature would be revealed to Claire in a way she couldn't rationalize or ignore. I needed to force him into a corner where his mask would slip completely, and I needed to do it in a way that would protect my grandchildren from the fallout when their world inevitably collapsed around them. The restaurant incident had been spontaneous, a moment of frustration that accidentally exposed Alan's financial vulnerability. Now I was going to use everything I had learned about him to create a much more systematic revelation of who he really was. Alan had spent 3 years playing games with my family's security and happiness. It was time to show him what happened when he played those games against someone who actually understood the rules. The first crack in Alan's carefully constructed facade appeared on a Tuesday morning in October. I was having my coffee and reading the newspaper when my phone rang. Claire's number flashed on the screen, but when I answered, I could barely recognize my daughter's voice. "Dad?" She sounded small, confused, like the little girl who used to call me when she had nightmares. "There's something wrong with my credit card. The school is saying they can't process the tuition payment, and when I called the bank, they said my account access has been suspended." I took a slow sip of my coffee, choosing my words carefully. "That's strange, sweetheart. Did you call the credit card company directly?" "I tried, but they said I'm not authorized to discuss the account anymore. They said only the primary account holder can make changes." Her voice cracked slightly. "Dad, that's you, isn't it? Did you do something to my cards?" The hurt in her voice was genuine, and for a moment I almost wavered. This was my daughter, my only child, the person I had loved unconditionally for 38 years. But then I remembered Alan's voice on those recordings, talking about using me as a resource, and my resolve hardened. "Claire, I think we need to talk. Can you come over this afternoon? Alone?" There was a long pause. Alan usually comes with me when I visit. This time I need to speak with just you. She arrived at 3 o'clock, looking more fragile than I had seen her since Margaret's death. Her usually perfect makeup was smudged, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her clothes wrinkled as if she had been sleeping in them. She sat across from me in the living room where she had once done homework and told me about her day at school. "Dad, what's happening?" "The kids' school called this morning saying tuition is overdue." The house payment bounced. Alan's car got repossessed yesterday. She looked at me with desperate eyes. "Did you cancel everything? Are you punishing us for what happened at the restaurant?" I leaned forward, my hands clasped together. "Claire, when is the last time you looked at your own financial statements?" She blinked. "What do you mean?" "When is the last time you saw a bank statement, a credit card bill, a mortgage payment? When is the last time you knew exactly how much money was in your accounts or what bills were being paid with what funds?" Her face flushed. "Alan handles all that. He's better with money than I am." "Is he?" I pulled out a folder I had prepared, filled with copies of documents Maria had helped me gather. "Because according to these records, Alan has been gambling away your money for 2 years. He's been using our family's credit to fund betting accounts, taking cash advances to cover his losses, and lying to you about where the money goes." Claire stared at the papers I placed in front of her, her face growing paler with each page. Bank statements showing massive cash withdrawals, credit applications made in her name, loan documents with forged signatures. This can't be right," she whispered. "Alan doesn't gamble. He's told me gambling is for losers." "Claire, your husband has been attending court-mandated Gamblers Anonymous meetings for 8 months. He was arrested for check fraud in Nevada last year. He's been married 3 times before, and all 3 previous wives filed restraining orders against him." The color drained completely from her face. "That's impossible." "Alan told me he had only been married once before, and his ex-wife was crazy." I pulled out more documents. "Alan Morrison, that's his real name by the way, not Alan Mitchell, has a criminal record spanning 15 years. identity theft, fraud, assault. The man you married is not who he pretended to be. Claire stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Why are you telling me this now? Why didn't you say something before? Because I didn't know before. Because I trusted your judgment, and I wanted to believe that you had found someone who would take care of you and the children. I joined her at the window. Claire, I've been subsidizing Alan's gambling addiction for 3 years without knowing it. Every dollar I gave you for house repairs or investment opportunities went straight to his bookies. She turned to face me, tears streaming down her cheeks. How much? Nearly $400,000? The number hit her like a physical blow. She sank into Margaret's old chair, her hands covering her face. Oh God, what have I done? For the next hour, I walked her through everything I had discovered. The fake job, the secret debts, the other women, the lies about his past. I showed her Alan's social media posts bragging about manipulating our family, played her recordings of him discussing strategies for extracting more money from me. With each revelation, I watched my daughter transform from a confused victim into someone who was beginning to understand the scope of her situation. It was like watching someone wake up from a 3-year nightmare. The worst part, she said finally, her voice hoarse from crying, is that I defended him to you. I thought you were being difficult, that you didn't understand how hard it was for us. I actually told people that you were getting senile and jealous of my marriage. That hurt more than I expected it to, but I pushed the pain aside. Alan is very good at manipulation, Claire. He made both of us into exactly what he needed us to be. What do I do now? She asked, looking at me with the same helpless expression she had worn as a child when facing problems too big for her to solve alone. That was the question I had been preparing for. First, you need to understand that your marriage is over. Alan isn't going to change, and he's becoming increasingly desperate. Desperate people do dangerous things. She nodded, seeming to accept this more easily than I had expected. Second, you need to protect yourself and the children legally and financially. I've already removed you from my credit accounts to prevent further damage, but you need to freeze your own credit, change your bank accounts, and document everything for divorce proceedings. What about the house? The kids' school? This was the difficult part. Claire, the house is gone. Alan used it as collateral for loans you never knew about. You're going to have to declare bankruptcy and start over. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched my daughter realize that her entire life as she knew it was collapsing, that everything she thought was real had been built on lies and theft. I don't have anywhere to go, she whispered. Yes, you do. I sat down beside her. You and the children can stay here while you figure things out, but there are conditions. She looked up at me, hope flickering in her eyes. Alan is not welcome in this house ever again. If you choose to try to work things out with him, you'll have to do it somewhere else. And Claire, you need to understand that I can't fix this for you. I can help you rebuild, but I won't enable another person to take advantage of our family. She nodded vigorously. I understand. Dad, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. The apology helped, but what helped more was seeing my daughter return to herself, seeing the woman I had raised emerge from underneath Alan's manipulation and control. That evening, while Claire was upstairs helping Emma and Jacob understand why they would be staying at Grandpa's house for a while, my phone rang. Alan's number appeared on the screen. I let it ring 4 times before answering. Charles. Alan's voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the desperation underneath. We need to talk. No, Alan, we really don't. Listen, old man. I don't know what lies you've been feeding Claire, but you're making a big mistake. You think you can just cut me off and steal my family? The mask was finally slipping. The charming, respectful son-in-law was gone, replaced by the real Alan Morrison. I haven't stolen anything, Alan. I've simply stopped paying for your gambling debts. There was a long pause. You have no idea what you're dealing with. I have friends, Charles. People who don't like being disappointed when money they're expecting doesn't show up. Was he threatening me? After everything he had done, was Alan Morrison actually threatening me? Is that supposed to scare me, Alan? It should. You think you're so smart, cutting off the money, turning Claire against me. But you're just a lonely old man who's about to find out that some games have consequences you can't afford. I hung up and immediately called Maria Santos. If Alan was desperate enough to make threats, he was desperate enough to act on them. It was time to make sure my family was protected from whatever Alan might do when he realized his free ride was permanently over. The war wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen making breakfast for 3 generations of my family. Emma was at the table doing homework, her dark hair falling across her face in the same way Claire's had at that age. Jacob was building something elaborate with his cereal, creating architectural structures that defied both gravity and nutrition. Claire sat across from them, reviewing job applications on her laptop, looking more like the daughter I remembered than she had in years. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. The first few weeks after Alan's departure had been chaos: lawyers, police reports, bankruptcy filings, and the messy process of untangling 3 years of financial fraud. Claire had cried more in those early days than I had seen her cry since she was a teenager, mourning not just her marriage but the life she thought she had been living. Alan had made good on his threats in a way. He had tried to break into the house twice, both times when he was drunk and desperate. The security system I had installed caught him on camera, and the restraining order Claire filed was supported by plenty of evidence. He had also attempted to turn Emma and Jacob against both Claire and me, telling them that their mother and grandfather were cruel people who had destroyed their family out of spite. But children, I learned, are more resilient and perceptive than adults often give them credit for. Emma had apparently been aware for months that Alan was different when he thought no one was watching. Jacob had never really warmed to his stepfather, sensing something false in Alan's performative affection. When Claire finally told them the truth in age-appropriate terms, both children seemed more relieved than devastated. I always knew something was wrong. Emma had confided to me one evening while we were washing dishes together. Alan was always nice to us when Mom was around, but when she wasn't, he acted like we didn't exist. And he was always whispering on the phone about money and getting angry when he thought no one could hear. The financial recovery had been more complex. Claire's credit was destroyed. The house was indeed lost to foreclosure, and most of their possessions had been sold to pay Alan's debts. But bankruptcy, I discovered, could be liberating in its own way. It forced Claire to start over with a clear understanding of her actual situation, rather than the illusion Alan had created. I had helped, but carefully, strategically. Instead of simply giving Claire money to solve her problems, I had helped her develop skills to solve them herself. I paid for her to take accounting courses so she could understand financial statements. I supported her decision to pursue a nursing degree that would give her long-term career security. I provided childcare and housing, but I made it clear that these were temporary supports while she rebuilt her independence. The trust I had established for Emma and Jacob remained intact, designed to support their genuine needs without creating the kind of dependence that Alan had exploited. College tuition would be covered, but through direct payments to institutions rather than cash that could be misappropriated. Healthcare costs would be handled through dedicated accounts that couldn't be accessed for other purposes. Claire had protested initially, feeling that I didn't trust her judgment anymore. It took several difficult conversations for her to understand that the restrictions weren't about her trustworthiness, but about protecting the children from future predators who might target our family's resources. "I don't ever want to be that vulnerable again," she had finally admitted. "I don't want someone to be able to lie to me about money because I don't understand how money works." The most satisfying change, though, was in our family dynamic. With Alan gone, Claire had gradually returned to the woman I remembered. Intelligent, funny, independent, and genuinely caring, rather than performatively perfect. Emma and Jacob had space to be children rather than props in Alan's ongoing performance of family man. Our Sunday dinners had resumed, but they were different now. Real conversations instead of Alan's monologues, genuine laughter instead of forced politeness. The children asked questions and told stories without constantly checking to see if Alan approved. Claire offered opinions and made decisions without deferring to a husband who had never deserved that level of trust. I had also changed, perhaps more than I initially realized. The process of protecting my family had reminded me that I was still capable, still valuable, still the patriarch of this family in ways that mattered. I wasn't just a source of funding or a relic to be managed. I was someone with wisdom, experience, and strength that my family needed. The legal resolution had taken months, but eventually, Alan Morrison was charged with multiple counts of fraud and identity theft. His previous victims had come forward once they learned about the investigation, and the pattern of his behavior was undeniable. He would spend the next 3 to 5 years in prison, and when he was released, he would have to register as a financial offender and maintain distance from his previous victims. Claire had testified at his sentencing hearing, and I had never been more proud of her courage. She looked Alan directly in the eyes and told the judge exactly how his lies had affected not just her, but Emma and Jacob, who had lost their stability and their sense of security because of his choices. The defendant didn't just steal money, she had said, her voice steady and clear. He stole 3 years of my children's childhood, 3 years of my relationship with my father, and 3 years of my own life that I can never get back. He made me complicit in hurting the people I love most, and that's something I'll have to live with forever. Alan had tried to interrupt her statement, to offer excuses and justifications, but the judge had silenced him. When he was led away in handcuffs, he looked nothing like the confident, charismatic man who had charmed his way into our family. He looked like what he had always been. A small, pathetic predator who had finally run out of victims willing to enable his behavior. But the real victory wasn't Alan's imprisonment or the recovery of some of the stolen money. The real victory was the quiet morning routines, the family dinners where everyone actually wanted to be present, the absence of tension and manipulation that had poisoned our interactions for 3 years. Emma had started calling me Grandpa Charles again instead of the formal Mr. Charles that Alan had insisted was more appropriate. Jacob had begun asking me to teach him about money and business, showing a genuine curiosity about the work I had done for 40 years. Claire had started seeking my advice again, not because she felt obligated to include me, but because she valued my perspective. On a sunny Saturday morning in spring, almost exactly 1 year after the restaurant incident that had started everything, I found myself in my backyard watching Jacob and Emma plant a garden where Margaret's roses used to grow. Claire was inside preparing lunch, humming softly to herself in a way I hadn't heard since before Alan entered our lives. The children were debating the merits of different vegetables with the serious intensity that only kids can bring to such discussions. Emma wanted tomatoes because they were practical and useful. Jacob wanted sunflowers because they were basically giant flowers that you can eat. Their compromise, a row of practical vegetables surrounded by beautiful flowers, seemed like a perfect metaphor for what our family had become. "Grandpa," Emma said, wiping dirt from her hands on her jeans, "do you think Alan will ever try to come back?" It was a question she had asked several times over the past months, and I understood the anxiety behind it. Children need security, predictability, the assurance that the adults in their lives can protect them from chaos. "No, sweetheart," I told her, the same answer I had given before. "Alan can't come back. The law won't let him, and even if it did, your mother and I wouldn't let him hurt our family again." Jacob looked up from his sunflower seeds. "Good. I didn't like him anyway. He made Mom sad all the time, and he made you sad too, out of the mouths of children." Jacob had seen more clearly than any of the adults what Alan had been doing to our family's emotional well-being. That afternoon, as we sat around the kitchen table eating Claire's homemade soup and the children told animated stories about their school friends and upcoming summer plans, I realized that this was what I had been fighting for all along. Not money or respect or recognition, but simply the right to love my family without interference from someone who saw us as resources to be exploited. Alan Morrison had tried to erase me from my own family's life, to make me irrelevant and disposable. Instead, his greed and desperation had ultimately strengthened the bonds between the people who actually mattered. He had forced us to rediscover what real family looked like, what genuine love and support meant when they weren't contaminated by manipulation and false performance. The old Charles, the one who had accepted humiliation and disrespect because he was so desperate to maintain family unity, was gone. In his place was someone who understood that real love sometimes required difficult choices, that protecting the people you care about might mean disappointing them temporarily, and that setting boundaries was not cruelty, but wisdom. As I tucked Emma and Jacob into bed that night, listening to their prayers and their plans for tomorrow's adventures, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete peace. My family was safe, my legacy was secure, and my role as patriarch was no longer questioned or undermined. Alan Morrison had taught me an invaluable lesson, though not the one he had intended. He had shown me that you can never truly lose something that genuinely belongs to you. Family, real family, survives manipulation and lies and even years of systematic emotional abuse. What doesn't survive is the counterfeit version that predators create to serve their own needs. I was 65 years old, and for the first time since Margaret's death, I felt truly at home in my own life.